Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. I am Jojo19 and I am going to be doing a tier list video on the likelihood and electoral favourability of different vice presidential candidates for presidential hopeful and former President Donald Trump. I've stated in several videos now that I believe that he is going to be the nominee for the Republican Party in the 2024 presidential election. I don't believe that's going to change, at least dramatically, over the next 11 months. I believe that it's likely he will be nominated, but one thing that isn't necessarily clear is who his vice presidential pick will be, in regards to who will serve on the ticket with him, perhaps represent a demographic that is different to him, or one that he should represent as a means to gain their vote or to appeal to them, one that has different views, or similar views depending on his preference. In 2016 and in 2020, he went with former Indiana Governor Mike Pence. Mike was a conservative choice. He seemed more so conservative than Trump in some instances, but he was fairly fine with the establishment. He wanted to take down the bureaucracies, you might say, in a systematic way, and he was able to appeal to morally based family voters. He was largely seen as a strong choice for the type of demographic that Trump was trying to appeal to, and for that reason, it really helped him out. This tier list features more candidates, with some excluded, such as Francis Suarez. The reason for that is because I don't believe that Trump necessarily will pick someone with very little notoriety. That's not to say that they necessarily come from the primary. As you can see, there are several candidates here who aren't running. Nonetheless, I will rank them in accordance with the tier list, despite the fact that I wouldn't have some candidates on here necessarily. But with that, I think we should get started. I'm going to start by going from the bottom up, and I think I'm going to continue with that throughout the video. The reason for that is there are several candidates here who are clearly not going to be the vice presidential candidate. The first one that I'd like to point out is Michael Pence. Mike Pence has come out against Trump's rhetoric over the past 12 months, specifically in his campaign for the presidential election. If he were to become the vice presidential nominee, it would be seen as a complete betrayal of Trump's standpoint in regards to Mike's views and Mike's opinion on the 2020 election. It would be a complete reversal, and he would end up losing a large amount of the demographic that he's built up over the last 2 years. So no, I don't believe that he'll be choosing him, in short. Another that I'd like to brush off is Chris Sununu. I don't know why he's on this list. This list is generally meant to be in regards to who is running for the presidency, or the rest of these candidates here really all have viable choices, but Chris is a moderate. He hasn't expressed, I don't think, any interest in running for the nomination, nor would he get anywhere because he is far too moderate and far too unknown outside of his own state, which is New Hampshire. If he were, though, I will speculate, let's hypothesize here. If he were to become the vice presidential nominee, that would be seen as a drastic reversal of Trump's usual rhetoric. Chris is a moderate, of course, social and fiscally. Probably I'd say that it would hurt him, generally speaking, because although Trump would be pandering to a more moderate base, you'd be surprised as to how many moderate Republicans are actually fine with voting for Trump. A lot of people would rather him over Joe Biden, though they would usually likely vote for a third-party candidate prior to that. Chris's placement on the ticket would actually help him in that instance. However, it would generally be seen as a reversal and a weak choice, and I don't think for a second, and this stands for Mike Pence as well, that he would accept the nomination. I think he would say, no, don't nominate me. The final one I'd like to brush off is Chris Christie, for the same reasons, but more so actually than the two of these guys, that these would be a landslide loss. He would be a significant landslide loss. There's been no one who's come out more so against Trump in the Republican nomination than Chris Christie. Despite the fact that he flip-flopped in 2016, having first opposed him, then supported him, Chris Christie is now seen as a fervent anti-Trump candidate, as some people would call him a rhino. Trump would never accept his nomination. He would never want it. There is no reason that anyone would nominate him under the current pretense that Trump's campaign would be falling under. Now we're going to move up to comfortable loss. So this is a category that I've specified that would not necessarily be a landslide backflip, but it would generally be seen as everybody knows he's going to lose because of this choice. And the candidate that I'm going to put in this slot is Asa Hutchinson. Asa Hutchinson has come out pretty strongly, particularly in the debate in regards to Trump's rhetoric after the 2020 election. Asa Hutchinson has come out strictly saying that he believes that there was no fault and no disintegrity in that election. Another big problem, and you may have noticed this, is that another big problem with Asa Hutchinson is his age. He is, I believe he's over 70 at this point, maybe pushing 70, but Trump is relatively old as well. Younger than Biden, yes, but only by 4 years. To have two candidates on the ticket who are very old, that is going to be a prime concern for anti-Biden candidates who will therefore maybe otherwise go for someone like Joe Manchin, or want someone younger in this field. Now, I think Asa Hutchinson wouldn't be able to remedy that despite his emphasis on his ability as Arkansas governor to deliver particularly agricultural reform, which will be a significant issue considering the current economic factors for rural voters and for voters in the plains like Nebraska. Now, that's not to say that those states are going to be swinging, but those states, such as Kansas, such as all the way down to Texas, will want someone who empathizes with those kinds of small local communities. That's something that Asa Hutchinson could do, and he would certainly, I think, if anything, prevent the rise of a blue Texas, but it would still not be enough to create even a somewhat likely victory in the North or in places like Michigan. He has no appeal to those groups. The next candidate I'm going to put in here is John Bolton, just very briefly, because I don't think he should be in this tier list. I believe he was the former national security advisor. He may have been something else. I actually don't know a lot about him, but I will say, again, the age issue is a big thing. It's going to be difficult to run a successful campaign with two people on a ticket that are over the age of 70. Again, notoriety is another big thing. He's not running for president, which is difficult for him to get that kind of image that a lot of these other candidates have, so I don't believe that he'd do anything for the ticket in particular. The next category I'm going to put down is leaning loss. Now, this actually might be a surprise to you. You may have thought that I would already put him somewhere below on the tier list, but the candidate I'm going to put in leaning loss is actually Ron DeSantis, and there's a reason for this. Okay, I still believe that Ron DeSantis being on the ticket would result in a loss, but I want you just to consider this for a moment. One of the big problems that a lot of Trump candidates, and these aren't necessarily candidates that are always going to go for Trump. They may trickle down into people like Nikki Haley or Vivek Ramaswamy, but a lot of candidates favourable to Trump's nomination have criticised Ron DeSantis for running such a disastrous campaign but pledging an image of electability as a Republican candidate, as a young and inspiring candidate. That's actually a big concern for a large portion of the Republican demographic, an idea of uniting the party, because a lot of people believe that Trump is the only man who can create an election victory, and that's fine. But ultimately, any candidate that comes out against them, or any candidate that runs their own campaign as a result of that, is therefore going to be, in their eyes, seen as someone who is trying to break up the party, to divide the nation. It's a national division, as you might say. But if Ron DeSantis were to hypothetically join the Trump campaign as a vice presidential candidate, I actually don't think it would be that disastrous. I think it could probably help him in some instances with a pledge of national unity. If Ron DeSantis were to perhaps make amends with Trump in regards to his criticism for calling him a fake conservative. But keep in mind, this has been done before with people like Chris Christie in 2016. Even in 2020, in the Democrats, between Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, they were fervent opponents, and yet they were vice presidential, and they're now the vice president and president, respectively. So I actually think that although it would still be a loss, I think there would be a lot of voters who would feel betrayed by this decision. And I also don't believe that this would ever happen in a million years. I don't think Trump would ever go for Ron DeSantis and give him that victory, because it is kind of a victory in a sense. But I do think it is a potentially feasible idea. I don't think it's out of left field, because you have Spiro Agnew and Richard Nixon in 1968, and that was seen as pretty out of nowhere. Crazy, you might say. But that was successful. That was successful in a landslide. And generally speaking, I think this could be something. But generally, no, I would still call it a loss. But it shouldn't just be thrown away, is what I'll say. Just before we move on from Ron, there is actually one more candidate I'd like to put in comfortable loss, and that's Tucker Carlson. It would generally be a mistake, I think, to put someone who has the same kind of really anti-bureaucratic, anti-establishment rhetoric as Tucker Carlson. I think on his own, as a presidential candidate, Trump's field would absolutely support him, and this wouldn't do him any harm with that demographic. But you'll find that a lot of moderate voters wouldn't accept someone like Tucker Carlson on the ticket. They'd want someone a bit more measured and a bit more happy to move through the system, like Mike Pence. That was the strategy in 2016 that worked so well for Trump. And I don't think, despite it would hurt that demographic as opposed to Trump's core mainstream base, which is to say people who oppose the establishment. They'd be very happy with this choice, and notoriety wouldn't be a problem, but generally I don't think it would be the route to go down. Now we go for toss-up. These are the candidates that could be, if they were put as vice presidential candidates, could maybe help, maybe hurt his campaign. I've got a few candidates in mind for this one. The first one is Nikki Haley. Nikki Haley for toss-up. The reason I'm putting Nikki Haley in the toss-up is because one of the big things, again, about this election for the Republican Party is going to be representing an audience that is not necessarily trending for the Republicans. It's not necessarily one that goes with the Republicans usually. That's a young base, that's a minority base, and that's first-time voters. I think with Nikki Haley, one of the things is going to be that she's backtracked on a lot of her comments since the beginning of the primary, sorry. I think one of the problems with Nikki Haley in this instance is if she was a vice presidential candidate, she would have to really backtrack on a lot of the rhetoric she used at the beginning of the primary season, whereby she stated that MAGA and Trump supporters was harmful to the Republican Party and electorally dangerous. I think she would have to really go back on that, and she would again have to appeal as someone like Mike Pence as a fairly resonant and understanding candidate that's going to appeal to moral and family-based values. That's been a core issue of her campaign. I spoke about her in great detail in regards to her debate performance just a few days ago. I amended a previous overview of what I saw as fairly mild result. But now I think as a result of that, and I think as a result of the onset of her surge, I think she's going to improve drastically. Her notoriety is not going to be a problem in that case. Again, she came in very early to the campaign season. So I don't think that's going to be a problem. She is a woman. Again, that's going to be a big thing, is representing that female base after Roe v. Wade. I think that's going to be something that the Republican Party desperately needs if they're going to succeed with places like Michigan, succeed with places like Arizona. Places like those, states like those, are going to be very hingent on addressing, as Francis Suarez said at the beginning of his campaign, the suburban woman and appealing to the middle class. Nikki Haley, I think, could do that, but it is going to be a bit of a coin toss as to whether her nomination would help or hurt Trump's electability. I do just want to stress that the tier list here doesn't necessarily represent the election as a whole. It's a matter of how the vice presidential candidate, their result, could help the campaign on an electoral level. So, for example, Nikki Haley going onto Trump's campaign, would that result in a more likely comfortable electoral majority or a landslide loss? it's a spectrum, as you might say. It doesn't necessarily constitute a comfortable electoral majority if she were on there, but it is what would most likely happen. But for example, someone up on this area here would likely reach around about 300 to 330 electoral votes. That's what a comfortable victory looks like. The next candidate I'd like to put up in the toss-up section is Larry Elder. I spoke about Larry Elder in great detail in my candidate overview and in my tier list video. He's seen as a paleo-conservative, you might call him, character. Someone who really appeals to the moral and libertarian values that the Republican Party is founded off of these days. That would help with Trump's usual anti-establishment base, no issue there. But in regards to moderate voters, a lot of the things that he's been saying has made him sound more so like a libertarian candidate than a Republican candidate. He believes in restricting abortion to any extent. That's more conservative than Trump. He believes in complete ownership, Second Amendment access to weaponry. That's different to what Trump may believe. He's also a very socially conservative individual in regards to LGBTQ+ rights and other progressive movements, more so than Trump. That emphasis in his campaign for president, of course he's running for president, would likely do the same damage that DeSantis' campaign has done to his favourability. But it's not to say that it wouldn't help the candidate to the ticket in particular. Larry Elder's a minority. He's got a fairly decent notoriety. He was the host of a libertarian debate in 2016. And of course, he's gotten some traction as a result of his running for governor of California during a recall election for Gavin Newsom, and also in this primary season. But I don't know, it could help Trump or it could hurt him. Age is another big thing. He's not particularly old. He's in his early to mid-70s, I believe, but that will be something noticeable. So it's a matter of how charismatic he can be, I suppose. And another big issue, just while I remember, is that he has not held public office, ever. So that's going to be another problem that Tucker Carlson has. But generally speaking, Larry Elder has not been romanticized to the same aspect that Tucker Carlson has as an anti-establishment candidate. Now we're moving up to likely victory. I have sort of created two categories for a likely to narrow victory. I've spread them out, and there are different candidates that I'd like to put in these different sections. The first of which is Doug Burnham. Doug's going in likely. Doug Burnham has run a very interesting presidential campaign. One that's not necessarily been based on policy, but more so on values, on moral issues, on trust, on likability, on genuinity. He's been there. He's been talking about his role as a farmer, and I believe his family sold elevators for livestock and for produce in North Dakota. He's been talking a lot about the trust that he and his family had to build up over those years working in that industry. Doug Burnham, for that reason, is the modern-day Mike Pence. Just think about it. The man has not necessarily come out against Trump. He has said vaguely that he believes him to be a sore loser, but that's not necessarily too much to get him on Trump's radar, negatively speaking. He's seen as a very likable person, and he's younger than some of these other candidates, and he has also got experience as a debater and as a worker in legislative agenda. And also he's a governor, again, a governor of a plains state, North Dakota. Again, remember what I was talking about with Asa Hutchinson and with Mike Pence. Now, it's not a swing state, but neither was Indiana. That'll help him in Wisconsin. That'll help him in Texas. That'll help him in Georgia. Think about this. Doug Burnham could actually be a great candidate for Trump as a vice president. But he's not the best. Doug Burnham, for that reason, I actually think could just push him over the line in regards to his electability in the 2024 presidential election. Just have a think about it. After this video, it could work for his electoral margin. But the big problem is, of course, age. He is still pretty old. I believe he's just turned 60 or is around that age. He's not a minority. He's not going to appeal to anything further than a conservative to moderate base. But I chose this tier list for a reason, and that is because Kristi Noem was on it. Kristi Noem is the governor of South Dakota, and she is everything that Doug Burnham is, but better, electorally speaking. She is a minority, she's a woman, which is something that the Republican Party, as I've said, desperately needs to represent. She's young, she represents still a plain state, she has legislative experience, and she represents the same critical values that conservative and morally speaking voters have in regards to when they vote. She would be a strong choice for Trump's electability. She would represent what the Republican Party needs to do going forward if it's to win in places like Wisconsin and Arizona. The big problem in this instance, though, is notoriety. Doug Burnham has at least run a campaign. No one kind of knows who she is. And that's going to be a problem. However, I don't think it would be enough to keep her from the true value of her candidacy on the ticket. I believe that the values she represents, her legislative experience, particularly in South Dakota, and her relationship with the state government there, of course she's the governor, that would appeal greatly to the Republican demographic. And so I believe that it would be a good choice. The next candidate I'm going to put in narrow victory is Tim Scott. Tim Scott, again, Senator from South Carolina, good legislative experience, not necessarily too old, enough to have experience, enough though to still appear as charismatic and young. Maybe not as articulate as some other candidates, but still a minority and a portion of the Republican base that would be very strong, electorally speaking, to represent on the ticket. Of course, I'm referring to African Americans. Particularly after the Black Lives Matter riots of 2020, Tim Scott was someone who advised Trump on a lot of racial issues, and I believe that their relationship, he hasn't necessarily come out against Trump's views on the integrity of the election in 2020, but he has, generally speaking, come off as someone to appeal for moral values. He's socially conservative. He believes in states' rights. He believes in the Second Amendment and things like that the conservative or even moderate Republicans who are on the edge about Trump will really appeal to in regards to voting for him. And I think he really represents what a lot of Mike Pence did back in 2016, but perhaps even more electorally favorable as a minority and in the current climate of the Republican Party. But nobody, ladies and gentlemen, compares to Vivek Ramaswamy as a vice presidential candidate. You all know where he was going from the moment this video started. He would result in a comfortable electoral majority. Every single person I speak to, who I know is a Republican or who I know is a conservative or even a moderate in some instances, or even progressives. I'm not even joking. I know some progressive people, some fairly progressive politicians from Australia, my country, who actually admire what Vivek Ramaswamy has done in his campaign. Every single person I speak to, who I know favours Republican politics at least, says they love Vivek Ramaswamy. They didn't necessarily love his debate performance. That's a video for another day. There actually has been some controversy, though, in regards to his favourability. He may have misspoken sometimes or spoken out of turn. He is young. He is a minority, and he has appealed to voters as someone who has worked for his fortune. He's called himself the success of the American dream. He's lived it, he says. And that is exactly what young and first-time voters want to hear. They want to hear hope. They want to hear hope in times of economic strain. And that is something that he will be able to crucially capitalize on if he was the vice president. I actually think that his campaign has kind of enforced that Trump will need to pick him. Now, the big problem is going to be legislative experience. He does not have any public office to his name. But ultimately, he has experience in the business, in the private sector, and in pharmaceuticals, which I don't know what you do with that in politics, but one of Trump's big things is going up against big pharma, so perhaps there's a line of work there. We don't know. But electorally speaking, I think Vivek Ramaswamy could really push Trump over the line. Like, seriously, this is 300 plus electoral votes. That's not necessarily to say he'd win the popular vote, but in states like Pennsylvania, in states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, even New Mexico, again, video for another day, Texas, Georgia, Florida, where there are young voters coming out in droves to vote, a lot of whom are conservative, Vivek Ramaswamy is the exact person to represent them and push Trump over the line for the 2024 presidential election. Now, the only candidate we haven't ranked here is Trump, for obvious reasons. I'm sure if he could pick himself as vice president, he would be fine with doing that, but it's not possible. So that is my list, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. This video is much longer than I intended for it to be. In fact, it might be my longest video ever. But I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you agree. Well, no, I don't hope you agree. I hope you find my opinion to be one of trust. And I hope you and I can debate in the future about the validity of this. I'd love you to go down in the comments and object to it. Say, perhaps Chris Christie would bring him over the line. Who knows? But I'd love for you to be able to speak to me in regards to your opinion on these matters. And to do that, I'd recommend joining the Discord server or following my new Twitter account. But thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all on the next one. Thank you.